All right, so you've been wondering about the real differences between organic and regular foods, and we're here to help you sort through it all. We're going to break down the science, the pros and cons, and help you make the choices that work best for you. We've got some awesome research from food scientist Dr. Lev Nemotin, and the big question we're diving into is organic really worth all the extra money, or are regular foods just as safe and nutritious?
Well, the both sides have some really interesting points, It's not as simple as some people make it out to be.
Okay, so let's back up a sec. Before we even get into the risks and all that good stuff, let's define our terms. When we say organic and regular, what exactly does that mean when it comes to how our food is actually grown?
Yeah, good point. Let's start with organic. It's basically a system that tries to mimic nature as much as possible. So you're going to see a big emphasis on natural fertilizers like compost, and instead of those synthetic pesticides, they're using things like beneficial insects, crop rotation, things like that. Now, they do allow some naturally derived pesticides, but the regulations on those are really strict. So it's not like anything goes in the organic world.
Gotcha. So it's all about keeping things as natural as possible. What about regular foods then? What's the deal with those?
Right. So regular is often called conventional farming, and it's really all about maximizing efficiency and yields. So they're using synthetic fertilizers and pesticides because it's just more effective at preventing those losses. And sometimes they're even using GMOs.
Hold on, you're throwing acronyms at me now. What exactly are GMOs? For those of us who haven't taken a food science course recently.
All right, of course. GMO stands for genetically modified organism. Basically, they're plants or animals that have had their genetic makeup tweaked in a lab. It's done to give them specific traits like resistance to certain pests or maybe to increase their nutritional content. It's a pretty complex topic, but for now, just think of them as a tool in the conventional farming toolbox.
Okay, GMOs, got it. So we've got these two different approaches, organic and regular, and they each have their own set of rules, right?
Exactly. Both systems are regulated to make sure the food we eat is safe. For example, the EPA, the folks who keep our water clean, they set limits on pesticide residues in food. And the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, along with their European counterpart, the EFSA, they've got tons of regulations in place for all sorts of things to make sure our food is safe.
Okay, that makes sense. I mean, nobody wants to be eating food that's going to make them sick. But let's get real. What about those long-term health risks that everyone's always talking about with the synthetic chemicals in regular food? How worried should we actually be?
Yeah, that's a question we get a lot, and it's a valid concern. Look, all those regulatory bodies we just mentioned, they do a ton of testing, and they set safety thresholds for these chemicals. But there's still debate and research going on about the long-term impact of even small doses of these chemicals over a lifetime.
So they're basically saying it's probably fine, but they're still figuring it out. Not exactly putting my mind at ease here.
Well, think of it this way. Science is always evolving. Researchers are working hard to make sure they stay ahead of any potential problems. But even if human safety is taken care of, we also have to think about the impact on the environment. Those synthetic chemicals sometimes end up contaminating our water and soil, which, indirectly affects our health too.
Wow, I never thought of it like that. It's all connected, isn't it? Okay, so if regular foods have those potential risks, going organic seems like the obvious answer, right? But I have a feeling it's not quite that simple.
Yeah, it's not a perfect solution. One concern with organic is the risk of immediate microbial contamination. You see organic fertilizers like manure, they're natural, but they can increase the chances of things like E. coli or salmonella, especially if they're not handled properly.
So even though it's natural, it's not necessarily risk-free.
Exactly. Organic farming does have strict rules for things like composting and handling, but the risk is still there. It could even be a little bit higher than with synthetic fertilizers.
So it's like you're trying to avoid chemicals, but then you're opening the door to these other potential problems.
Kind of a trade-off. And here's another thing. Without those synthetic pesticides, organic farms often have more pests, which means the produce gets handled more. And that could potentially increase microbial exposure.
Seriously. I always thought more handling meant more chances for contamination, not less.
Yeah. It's counterintuitive, isn't it? And here's another little surprise for you. Organic produce often doesn't last as long. It has a shorter shelf life, which means it can spoil faster. And that increases the risk of foodborne illnesses if you're not careful.
So many things to consider. Okay, we've talked about the safety of both organic and regular foods. What about the nutrition side of things? Does organic automatically mean more nutritious?
Well, that's where things get a bit tricky. Some studies suggest organic foods might have slightly higher levels of certain nutrients, like antioxidants and omega-3s. But the difference isn't always huge. It's not like a night and day difference.
So it's not like I'm suddenly going to become superhuman if I switch to all organic kale, right?
Probably not. But here's an interesting point. Organic farming, with its focus on natural fertilizers and avoiding those synthetic ones, it might actually be better for the soil in the long run.
Speaking of soil, you mentioned earlier that conventional farming could potentially deplete nutrients from the soil over time. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure thing. Synthetic fertilizers, they can give you a boost in yields in the short term. But relying too heavily on them, it can lead to a decrease in the overall nutrient content of the soil. It's kind of like overdrawing from a bank account.
Makes sense.
Now, organic farming, on the other hand, with its focus on natural fertilizers and crop rotation, it's all about building and maintaining healthy soil over the long term.
So it's not just about what we're putting into our bodies, it's also about how we're treating the earth that provides that food right.
Absolutely. It's all connected. And that's a really important takeaway from Dr. Moten's analysis. He wants us to think about the bigger picture here, to consider the long-term impact of our food choices, not just on our individual health, but on the health of the planet too.
Okay, so we've talked about safety, we talked about nutrition, but let's be real for a minute. Organic food can be really expensive.
Oh, absolutely.
Does that mean only rich people can afford to eat healthy?
That's a great question, and you've hit on a really important point. The cost difference between organic and regular food can be significant, and that definitely creates a barrier for a lot of people. It raises some concerns about food inequality and who has access to these healthier options.
It's definitely a tricky situation, so is there any way to find a balance here? To minimize those risks, maximize the nutrition we're getting, and not go broke in the process?
That is the million-dollar question, isn't it? Luckily, Dr. Moten has some great advice on that. We'll dive into that right after this.
Awesome, I'm all ears.
So finding that balance between healthy eating and, not spending a fortune.
Yeah, because let's face it, not everyone can afford to buy all organic everything.
Right, and Dr. Moten gets that. He actually suggests a really practical approach, like a middle ground, you could say. He recommends checking out the environmental working groups lists. The Dirty Dozen and the Clean 15.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of those. But to be honest, I can never remember which is which.
No worries. It's easy to get it mixed up. So the Dirty Dozen, that's the list of produce that tends to have the highest levels of pesticide residues, even after you wash them. We're talking things like strawberries, spinach, kale.
Oh, kale. Yeah, I love my kale chips.
Exactly. So for those items, Dr. Moten recommends going organic if you can.
Okay, that makes sense. So if I'm going to splurge on organic, those are the ones to prioritize. What about the Clean 15 then?
The Clean 15, that's the good news list. Those are the fruits and veggies with the lowest pesticide residues. Things like avocados, sweet corn, onions.
Okay, so I can stick with my regular avocados and save my organic budget for those strawberries.
Exactly. It's all about picking your battles right. And this strategy lets you do just that. You're minimizing your exposure to those potential risks, both the chemical ones and the microbial ones, and you're not breaking the bank.
This is awesome. I love how Dr. Moten gives such practical advice. So we've talked a lot about the risks, but what about the benefits of organic? Especially when it comes to nutrition. Is organic food really more nutritious?
It's tempting to think so, right? I mean, it just sounds healthier. But as we mentioned before, the research is kind of mixed on that. Some studies do suggest that organic foods might have higher levels of some nutrients, but the difference isn't always huge. It's not a guarantee.
So no superpowers from organic kale then?
Probably not. But one thing that is interesting is that organic farming practices, they might actually be better for the soil in the long run.
You mentioned earlier that conventional farming could deplete nutrients from the soil over time.
Exactly. Those synthetic fertilizers, they can boost yields in the short term, but overusing them can lead to a decrease in the overall nutrient content of the soil. It's like you're constantly taking out more than you're putting back in.
Right, like overdrawing from your bank account.
Exactly. And organic farming, on the other hand, with its emphasis on natural fertilizers and crop rotation, it's all about building and maintaining that healthy soil. It's a more sustainable approach.
So it's not just about what we're putting into our bodies. It's about how we're treating the earth that's providing that food.
Absolutely. It's all interconnected. And that's one of the key things Dr. Moten wants us to remember. He wants us to think about the bigger picture, the long-term impact of our food choices, not just for our own health, but for the health of the planet.
What I really appreciate about Dr. Moten's perspective is that he doesn't make it seem like an all or nothing thing. It's not like you have to be 100% organic or you're doing it wrong.
I agree. He acknowledges that there are complexities.
Yeah.
And he encourages people to find what works best for them. It's about empowering people to make informed choices based on their own needs and values. And their budget, of course.
Well said. This deep dive has been super informative. I feel like I'm already making smarter choices at the grocery store. But before we wrap things up, does Dr. Namoten have any final thoughts or advice for our listeners?
He does, and it's something that I think will resonate with a lot of people. He encourages everyone to stay curious, to keep learning about this topic. It's a constantly evolving field, you know. New research is coming out all the time.
So we shouldn't just take this one deep dive and call it a day.
Yeah. Exactly. Stay engaged with the topic. And remember, there are so many resources out there to help you stay informed. You've got websites like the Environmental Working Group that we talked about. You've got reputable scientific journals. You can even just talk to farmers at your local market. They have a wealth of knowledge.
I love that. It's about taking ownership of your food choices.
Yeah.
And being an active participant in this whole conversation.
Exactly. And I think that's a great segue into our final thoughts on this whole organic versus regular debate. There's a lot to consider. And it's a decision that ultimately each individual has to make for themselves. But hopefully this deep dive has given you the knowledge and tools to navigate this complex world with confidence.
Beautifully said. Now let's take a moment to reflect on everything we've learned in this fascinating exploration of organic versus regular food. Okay, so we've covered a ton of ground on this whole organic versus regular food thing. And, you know, as we've been talking, I've been thinking about my own shopping habits. I kind of go back and forth between organic and regular. Depends what I'm buying, you know. But I've never really had a clear strategy.
It sounds like you're already doing some of what Dr. Namoten recommends without even realizing it. He's all about that personalized approach, understanding that everyone has different priorities.
So for someone listening right now who's thinking, okay, I get the basics, but where do I even start? What would be Dr. Namoten's top piece of advice?
He really emphasizes understanding your own personal context. Like, what are your biggest concerns? Are you worried about pesticide exposure? Especially if you have young kids or you're pregnant. Or are you more worried about your budget? Or maybe you have specific dietary needs.
So it's not about blindly following some set of rules. It's about making informed choices based on your own situation.
Exactly. It's about empowering yourself to make decisions that feel right for you and your family. Like if you're really concerned about those long-term effects of pesticides, then maybe leaning more towards organic makes sense for you.
That makes sense. But what about people who are more vulnerable to foodborne illnesses, like people with weakened immune systems? Would they be better off sticking with regular foods?
That's a great point, and Dr. Namoten addresses that directly. He says conventional foods, those ones that go through all those safety checks we talked about, they're perfectly safe. And they can be a great option for people who are at a higher risk of getting sick.
So it really is about finding that balance, weighing the risks and the benefits, and making choices that fit your needs. It's not about one being better than the other.
Exactly. It's about what works best for you as an individual. And you know what else I love about Dr. Namoten's approach?
What's that?
He encourages people to go beyond just accepting the information they're given. He says, if you're passionate about a particular aspect of this debate, like the environmental impact of different farming practices, do your own research. There's so much knowledge out there waiting to be discovered.
It's like he's giving us permission to be curious, to keep asking questions and digging deeper.
Absolutely.
You know, this whole conversation has really shifted my perspective. I used to think of organic versus regular as this black and white issue, but now I see it as more of a spectrum with lots of gray areas.
I think that's a much healthier way to look at it. It allows for flexibility and nuance.
Yeah.
Because there's no one-size-fits-all answer.
Exactly. And at the end of the day, what matters most is that we're all eating plenty of fruits and vegetables. No matter how they're grown, those are the real nutritional powerhouses. They give us all those vitamins and minerals and antioxidants we need.
Couldn't agree more. So to all our listeners out there, take what you've learned from this deep dive and apply it to your own life. Don't be afraid to experiment, try different things, and find what works best for you and your family.
And remember, this isn't the end of the conversation. Stay curious, keep learning, and enjoy those delicious fruits and veggies. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
See you next time.